All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit here, and we had been focusing on soccer for a little while and some of the barriers to soccer in the U.S. Now we're going to start talking about some of what we would probably be safe in considering hegemonic sports here in the U.S., and we're going to talk about their efforts to try and internationalize. We're going to start with baseball and hockey in this session. You see a picture here of the World Baseball Classic, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but that's one of the main efforts from Major League Baseball as a league to try and grow the sport outside of just the US and Canada. Well, let's start with the British Empire. Now, I know you're thinking, I'm tired of hearing about the British Empire. I thought this was a sports class. But it's just so important to understanding sports on a global scale. When we look at this map where in red we see the British Empire at its height, you notice that you've got listed here on this slide, you've got several countries that were part of the British Empire, and there's a big space there between America and Canada. And that's because what we see is in this list of countries toward the top, you see cricket as being a very popular sport as well as rugby. But we don't see that with the two countries, us in the US and our friendly neighbors to the north, Canada. You don't see those sports as being as popular. Now, when we look geographically at the map, of course, there's maybe something rather obvious about the US and Canada compared to the other countries in red, that being that we've got the Atlantic Ocean separating us, and we were discovered as a continent. There's a reason why we were called the New World, because we were discovered a little bit later than the other continents. And so what happens is you get cricket, or these countries that were part of the British Empire for longer than we were, and as a result they adopted the sports a little bit more closely from Britain. Instead, what happens in the US and Canada is we tended to transform the British games into sort of our own versions of those particular games. So rounders would be the sport that roughly developed into baseball. Rugby would be the English sport that roughly developed into what we know as American football, and Canadian football to our north. We'll talk more about this development and specifically how rugby evolved into American football later when we get into college sports, because there's a particular rivalry in college athletics that played a big role in that transition. So let's talk baseball to start with. There we go. The first professional sports team here in North America was a baseball team. Perhaps you know what it was. It's very famous in the Cincinnati metro region where we are in northern Kentucky. Of course, it's the Cincinnati Reds. And some of you might be aware even of the year, 1869, when that team was founded. And here we get a picture of that team. It was founded by the Wright brothers, not the same Wright brothers that were the first in flight, although that would be pretty amazing if you had the same brothers inventing airplanes and professional baseball. But no, these are a different set of brothers. And they founded what was known as the Cincinnati Red Stockings. At that time, there were no other professional clubs, of course. They were the first, and so they didn't have any opponents to play against that were professional teams, so they would play against the local team in the area, and which was made up of mostly amateurs, although there were some semi-professional teams in certain areas. And that team went undefeated in 1869. As you can imagine, if you're paying the players to do that full time, you're going to get the best players. And what happened over time is other areas started to develop their own professional teams, and eventually the National League was formed. But getting back to the Red Stockings, something else that they were notable for is the Wright brothers moved to Boston and took the team with them, essentially, which was the start of what we think of as being the franchise system, and teams that will, professional teams that will move around from city to city. In these modern times, mostly it's depending upon the stadium deal that they can get in a particular city. But that's very different from the club system that we see in Europe. And the authors of the chapter, the reading that's associated with this discussion in the Gaming the World book, point out that our university college sports system at the varsity level is more similar to Europe's club system than our North American pro franchises. And when they make that analogy, saying that our college sports are more similar to the club system in Europe and the rest of the world, what they're saying is that our college teams don't move around, right? They're very ingrained in the institution, which is very ingrained in the area where it's located, right? Northern Kentucky is not going to pick up and move to Central Kentucky or Southern Kentucky anytime soon, or hopefully anytime ever. So the teams are very much rooted in the university community, which is rooted in the geographic community here. And that's how the clubs are in Europe. They're not owned by a single owner, they're sort of owned by the community. Now that has evolved in Europe, and we've seen that change, and we've talked about that in other sessions as well, to become a little bit more like a franchise system that we have today, at least in the fact that some of the clubs have created shares that over time single owners have bought up a majority of shares and essentially become the owners of that club instead of the club members, or the ownership being dispersed amongst all the club members. But we've yet to see, there are a few instances, but we've yet to see any major instances of these owners trying to move, these owners in Europe trying to move their club to a different city. Like I said, with a few exceptions. And so that, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, you were probably aware of them as the first professional team, but you might not have been aware that they also set the precedent for this franchise system that teams could actually move around. And that's why we have the Boston Red Sox today, right? So there is a connection between those two organizations. The other thing to know about early baseball was that, somewhat like we talked about soccer, or like you read about in the growth and rise of soccer, particularly in Europe, baseball was sort of the working class sport, right? It was adopted by the masses of people, which is in contrast to a sport like cricket that remained relatively upper class in its following. And that, of course, led to, the working class nature of baseball and the acceptance of baseball by the lower classes or the working classes led to its rapid growth. In the U.S., we have, with baseball being our earliest professional sport, we have lots of integration of baseball terms into our everyday language, even when we're not referring to the sport itself. So one example, kind of a comical example, would be in physical relationships, right? You've all probably, at some point, maybe in junior high, high school, whatever, you go out on a date or something, you come back, and then the next day you're at school, and your buddies, your friends are saying, "Hey, how'd the date go?" I made it to first base, or I made it to second base, right? It all has this kind of connotation where we're using baseball lingo, but it's analogous to some level of physical relationship. But that's not all. That's kind of a one that we might chuckle at, but also there is integration into, like, when in the business world you give a very good presentation, a sales presentation, and you go back and you might talk to your boss or the owner of the organization. You say, "Boy, I really hit a home run with this presentation," or maybe it didn't go so well and you say, "Whoa, I really struck out." We've seen it even integrated into some of our laws, like some of the penal code and penalties for certain crimes in certain states. They have 3 strikes and you're out, right? Where on your 3rd offense, you get a much longer sentence. Obviously, that's baseball lingo, right? That has been integrated into that particular law. And you could probably think of lots of other examples of that. But it just goes to show how much baseball got integrated with our culture here in the U.S. Another aspect of baseball that happened early on in its development was that there was an effort to internationalize baseball by Albert Spalding. He had an ulterior motive. It wasn't solely to grow the sport. He wanted to sell his sporting goods equipment. And if he could grow the sport around the world, he would be able to have a larger market for his sporting goods equipment. We know Spalding as a sporting goods brand. You might think about it associated with basketball, perhaps mostly because it's the official ball of the NBA and they make the backboards. We see the logo up there when you watch an NBA game. But it started as solely a baseball company, and that's where they grew into the brand that they are today, of course, across several sports. But that world tour that Albert Spalding did in the early 1900s was relatively unsuccessful in spreading baseball outside of the U.S., and there are a couple reasons for that. One major reason is the complexity of the game, right? Unlike soccer that is very simple and can be explained quickly, baseball is relatively complex with lots of nuance to it. And we'll watch a clip here from one of the Ridiculous series of movies with Adam Sandler where he's trying to teach baseball. This is a representation or dramatization of Albert Spalding trying to teach baseball in other parts of the world.
Welcome, my friends, to the first ever playing of a new sport. A sport of my own devising. On this field, 2 10-person teams will engage in a battle of... Yes, Keith? Only 18 people here. 2 9-person teams will engage in a battle of strength, speed, and strategy. One team will go out onto the field to play defense, while the other team will take turns hitting this ball with a sticky.
What are you going to call this game?
What else? Sticky McSchnickens. Now your goal, ball thrower, is to get the ball past me 2 times without my hitting it. Fire when ready. I didn't know you were going to toss it quite so hard, ball thrower. All right. Okay, that's 2 past you. So you're done, right? No, I said 3 times. No, you said 2. I said 3. 3 strikes and I'm out. I know what I said, shortstop. That's your new name. Shortstop, that's right. Now and forever, forever and ever, shortstop. Shortstop, shortstop, shortstop. Yes, all right. Strike 3, you're out! No, the ball was too low. In order for it to count as a strike, it has to pass through the strike zone. Strike zone, that's right. You know, if you don't get the ball past me, between my knees and my titties, it's not a strike, it's a non-strike. And you've thrown me 4 non-strikes, I get an express ticket to first base without my even hitting it. All right, are we ready? That also gets me to first base as well. Where you going? Nobody hit it. I stole the base. You weren't looking, so I stole it.
You said you could only advance after you hit the ball.
Not when you're stealing.
That's bullshit.
Okay, shortstop.
He's moving.
Safe.
Oh, God dang, I don't know, that was tight.
Yes, and tie goes to the runner.
Why's that?
Because those are the rules of Sticky McSnickens. That's why. Hey, it's all mine. I've got it. Oh, no. You can't run. You cannot run. Infield fly rule. In full effect. ¿Por qué no? You're out. Oh, I'm not getting that. You can just run all the way home. A home runner. I need a cold drink. Let's take a 5-minute stretch and then start the second half.
Mr. Doubleday, we're done.
Well, we've only played 9 innings.
9 innings is enough.
So you get a little flavor there, obviously in a comedic way, of the nuances of baseball, right? And how the rules can be seen as being relatively arbitrary in some ways there. Hope you don't mind, I took a second to take a break there and fill up my coffee. You might have seen that I do have my green shoes on today. Don't think I've explained why I wear green shoes yet. I'm gonna hold off and save the mystery again. You might have discovered it online if you looked, but there is a method to the green shoes. Let's move on with baseball. So there are other popular regions of baseball around the world, and you can probably think of a few of those regions. So what comes to mind when you think of areas outside the U.S. where baseball is indeed popular? Certainly the Caribbean and Latin America has contributed lots of baseball players, and baseball is rather popular in those areas. Why those particular areas? Well, the U.S. military has had a pretty long presence in many of these countries, and because of that, you end up with not only the soldiers stationed there on different bases, but you end up with their families there, their kids there, military contractors there, and people that work with the military but aren't necessarily in the military. And so that's part of the reason is that they have brought their sport of baseball and spread it in those areas. Also, you have an influence of missionaries in those particular areas trying to spread whatever their religion is, but taking with them baseball. For the most part, we would be talking about Catholicism with that religion and founding schools where they might play baseball within the school. And when we think about players and we think about the Dominican Republic, you can probably name several of those players. One that will come up when we talk Red Sox Yankees, Pedro Martinez, Alex Rodriguez as well, part of the Red Sox Yankees rivalry, Manny Ramirez, another player within that rivalry, David Ortiz, Sammy Sosa, getting outside of that particular rivalry, of course, a very famous Dominican player, excuse me. Other Caribbean players, maybe the most famous one formerly within our region was Chapman, the reliever and one of the fastest throwers of all time, fastest pitchers of all time. And there's of course been other Cuban players that have defected here to the U.S. To play baseball. And Cuba is known as being a very talented baseball region, in a region where the people in general appreciate to a great degree, the game of baseball. Besides the Caribbean and Latin America, East Asia is the other region outside of the U.S. where baseball is extremely popular, we might say hegemonic. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, which is also known as Chinese Taipei, in particular in the Little League World Series. You might be familiar with seeing any of these listed countries as the foreign opponent to whoever wins the U.S. side of the bracket in the Little League World Series. Which brings us to the next point about baseball's efforts to globalize. The Little League World Series has certainly been a part of that. It's been international since 1947, so quite a long time. More recently, Major League Baseball started the World Baseball Classic in 2006. Which involves 16 teams, and I think has recently expanded beyond 16 teams, if I'm not mistaken. The authors quote Major League Baseball as, at the time of the Gaming the World book, as having 28% of players coming from outside of the U.S. So about 1 in 4 players, a little over 1 in every 4 players comes from outside of the U.S. So there is a level of internationalization to the game, although that internationalization is relatively regionalized in the regions that we just talked about. So what are the barriers to further expansion of Major League Baseball outside of the U.S.? Well, for one, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is seen by a lot of people as being anti-American, and there is a long reason for that. But to give you the short version, the U.S., just like when we talked about the World Cup in the U.S., strong influence in terms of TV ratings and sponsorship. The same thing happens with the Olympics, right? Where U.S. companies are the biggest sponsors of the Olympics. The TV rights in the U.S. is a huge revenue source, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, revenue source for the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And of course, the U.S. Olympic Committee, our regional Olympic Committee, or our National Olympic Committee, wants to keep some of that revenue or capture some of that revenue for its own operations, right? So you've got the International Olympic Committee trying to get money out of the U.S. that's associated with the Olympics, right, from U.S. sponsors and from our TV networks. And you've got the United States Olympic Committee saying, whoa, why don't you sponsor the U.S. Olympic team instead of sponsoring the overall Olympics, right, to these companies. And so there's been quite a bit of tension between the USOC and the IOC. And as a result, a lot of people are speculating that that's why the International Olympic Committee took baseball out of the Olympics in the 2000s, removed baseball because it is seen as an American sport, and we tended to dominate, although some of those other countries that we saw listed were also very successful in baseball in the Olympics. Cricket is another barrier. So when we talked about sports as a language earlier, and we watched the highlights of cricket, the analogies that we made to our sport language that we understand was baseball, right? And the flip side of that is in countries where cricket is very popular, baseball has had a hard time catching on, probably because fans see baseball and they think, well, we already have a sport like this, it's cricket, right? And then youth participation rates have also declined quite a bit in baseball, and at the same time we've seen the soccer participation rates for youth pick up quite a bit. So that creates another barrier. Now, whether there's causation there or if it's just a correlation between the declining rates in baseball and the increase in soccer, that's not for me to say right now, but I suspect that there is some sort of causation going on there. And Major League Baseball has has re-energized their youth initiative to try and build fields and create sporting space for baseball to happen in the cities. And our own Cincinnati Reds and the Reds Community Fund has been highly involved in that. Some of you, if you live in the Cincinnati metro area, might have baseball fields near your neighborhood that the Reds Community Fund helped to build or revitalize and make into some pretty nice baseball fields. So there is an effort on the part of baseball to raise the participation rates in baseball, not just here in the U.S., but as we're talking about internationally, right, in other countries as well, and to create the space for kids to be able to play baseball. So let's move to our other sport in this discussion, ice hockey. We mentioned that 28% of baseball players were international. Just over 28%, almost 29% of NHL players come from outside of North America. So not just international, but we're saying from outside of the U.S. and Canada. And a lot of those players come from Russia, right? We had what has been referred to as the Russian invasion happen in the late 1990s and early 2000s into the NHL. And the Red Wings became famous for taking lots of Russian players and being extremely successful with the Russian players on their team. So, talking about the origins sort of professional hockey, here in the U.S., you had the original 6 teams, 2 of which were in Canada, the Canadiens and the Maple Leafs, which is a rivalry that we'll talk about in a different session. But ice hockey originated in Canada. Of course, we imported it here into the U.S., and then we've seen the NHL grow quite a bit in their expansion strategies, mostly with U.S. franchises, although some Canadian franchises have also been added. The hockey benefits in its international efforts from being a pretty strong Olympic sport. So that certainly helps to internationalize the game. Also, it benefits from a very strong following and professional leagues in several other countries besides just the NHL. The NHL is seen as the top league around the world, but there are some other leagues that are pretty competitive to the NHL when we talk about level of play. So as we get into that, let's think about where is the sport itself hegemonic besides just the US and Canada. We've already mentioned one of those countries, Russia. You can probably think of a few others. If you're familiar with the Miracle on Ice, which was against the Soviet Union, that was actually a semifinal game, and the U.S. went on, I think it was to play Finland in the final, although now I'm second guessing myself, it might have been Sweden, but it was one of those first 2 countries, I think it was Finland, who the U.S. beat in the championship game after beating the Soviet Union in the semifinal in the Miracle on Ice. So those 2 countries are always very strong, Finland and Sweden. The Czech Republic, formerly the Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia used to be Czechoslovakia. That was always a very strong country, and individually those 2 countries are still, I think we could consider hockey as being hegemonic in those 2 countries. Russia, we mentioned, also popular leagues in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and to a lesser degree France as well. The second best professional league, getting back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, does anybody know or have an idea where that is? Any thoughts? Some of you might recall, if you're a hockey fan, that when the NHL went on strike and lost an entire season, a few players that were free agents, so not under player contracts with any NHL team, went and played in another league. And ESPN actually picked up games in that league, a few games in that league, because of the interest in hockey and the high level of play in that league. It was what's called the Continental Hockey League, the KHL, that's Continental with a K. That's the Russian league, which is widely thought of as being the second highest level of hockey. What are the barriers, though, to the further spread of hockey beyond just these countries we have listed, in addition to the U.S. and Canada? Well, it's of course seen as mostly as a regional sport in cold weather regions for obvious reasons. Although Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, one of his great achievements was to try and expand hockey beyond just the cold weather regions in the U.S., and he had what was called a Southern strategy to spread the game through the southern and western U.S., and it had mixed success. You know, some of those franchises struggle somewhat, but others are widely popular. But beyond that example in the U.S., for the most part, ice hockey does not thrive in any sort of climates other than relatively cold climates, or at least climates that have a cold winter. And so that leads to the question of kind of how widely understood is the language of hockey outside of those cold weather regions. When we think about terms like offsides and icing, and there's only 3 periods in hockey, what you get penalties for, the role of fighting within the game, I'm not sure how well that's understood once you get out of the cold climate regions. And another challenge that creates is that we've seen shifting migration patterns, not only in the U.S., but all around the world. We've seen migrations from cold weather climates to warm weather climates in the last several decades. Not coincidentally, that's happened after the invention and then widespread adoption of air conditioning, right? You might not think of air conditioning as being a problem for the game of ice hockey, but indeed, with the spread of air conditioning, it's made it much easier to live in very warm or hot weather climates because you can escape the heat in the worst months indoors, and that didn't used to be the case. And so since air conditioning has been widely adopted, we have seen population shifts, meaning that where ice hockey is popular, a lot of those areas have lost population over time, which means the loss of discretionary income that would go into supporting the sport and the leagues and the players that play professionally within that sport. So something to consider about a barrier for ice hockey's growth. All right, we will talk about a major ice hockey rivalry in a different session, and then also we will save for another session football and basketball.